Students of American political history recognize that, intellectually speaking, MAGA is nothing more than the socio-political devolution of Reaganism into Trumpism. Given the relatively homogeneous demographic makeup of the Republican base, outsiders struggle to comprehend the internal psychographics of Trump-era conservatism. But those of us who inherited a baby boomer conservative belief system do not. My first two episodes advocated my understanding of the heartless 0.1 percenters who run this country to help explain how today's status quo came to be. My last two episodes addressed how conservatives are manipulated by conservative politicians and conservative media outlets into voting against their own socioeconomic interests, and why those right-wing distraction tactics have worked so well for so long. Educated and enlightened Americans might have been able to surmise the insight I have offered thus far, but according to public discourse on mainstream media outlets these days, anti-Trump Americans still struggle to cope with what 21st century American conservatism has become, and how so many Americans enthusiastically support the Trump movement with their money, attention, and attendance. Now, I'm about to simplify MAGA so that anyone and everyone, including foreigners understandably befuddled by American conservative culture, can identify a MAGA member on the spot and spare themselves the emotional anguish of an intellectual challenge akin to teaching a fifth grader calculus. That would be, of course, convincing a conservative that their worldview is counterproductive to improving American society. Within the context of American political discourse, effective communication about MAGA should build upon Einstein's understanding of purposeful knowledge, making my eighth Dieter decree: simplicity is the essence of genius, but oversimplification is the death of progress. Many leftists appropriately discourage oversimplifying minority groups into monoliths. In turn, I seek to discourage you from oversimplifying conservatives into an intellectual monolith simply because they all seem to look, sound, and think the same way. It is very tempting for left-wing rhetoric to commit the fallacy of composition when analyzing MAGA Americans, but the truth is that they are not all from the Deep South and love to wave their Confederate flag. They don't all beat their Bible and tell you to vote Republican or you'll burn in hell. They are not all paranoid gun nuts, but most are. And you can definitely say that the ones we're going to be talking about today are. Welcome to the fifth foundational episode of American WASP, where we all agree you don't get change in America by asking nicely. I am your host, Dieter McBusiness, New England's favorite white Anglo-Saxon Protestant gone West Coastal. In 2016, Reaganism officially died, and Republicans became Trumplicans. In 2020, Trumplicans became Trump trash. And on January 6, 2021, Trump trash became terrorists. Are MAGA a band of misguided misfits that constitute nothing more than a public nuisance? Or is MAGA a sociopathic syndicate constituting an existential threat to our democracy? Now, I don't know about you, but when I watch mainstream media, I keep hearing the same kind of tired rhetorical questions I heard 8 years ago when Trump announced his candidacy for president. How can anyone support this idiot? Don't people see that this guy is just a narcissistic phony? Is half of America just straight up crazy for supporting this soon-to-be convicted criminal? The best way to answer those repetitive and redundant questions is to segment the tribes within the tribe of MAGA, then subsequently judge their citizenship without judging their humanity. according to that sociocultural segmentation. And that will determine if we are indeed in the middle of a culture war that could kill the country. If we are, I'm sorry to say it will probably be at least another generation before we see real progress. That means sometime in the 2030s. On that bright note, one of the right-wing media machine's favorite distraction tactics is to harangue the left about playing identity politics, which is classic right-wing projection, by the way. By identity politics, conservatives are, of course, referring to race, gender, and country of origin. Well, since Trump's base is 90% white, mostly male, and almost entirely devoid of immigrants, traditional identity politics analysis of their demographics does not yield a lot of insight into who these people are. Analysis of their psychographics, however, reveals that there are three major overlapping sects of MAGA, with heartless one-percenters as the fourth that manipulates the remaining three. MAGA America is an amalgamation of Confederate flag-waving, Bible-beating gun nuts. Sometimes the MAGA bro or B is one of the above, two of the above, or all of the above, but if they're MAGA and they're not one-percenters, they're never none of the above. Notice I didn't say Bible readers or responsible gun owners. That's a crucial distinction because I do not dismiss every Christian or gun owner as intellectually inferior. I got nothing but love for the Christ-like Christians, but I won't suffer the Antichrist Confederate Christians. I'd be down to go hunting with a gun enthusiast anytime, but the guy with the panic room stocked with AR-15s is not someone I'm likely to trust. The most difficult aspect of MAGA to accept is its size. After years of paying attention to political polls, particularly polls related to GOP psychographics, I can tell you with absolute certainty that Confederate flag-waving, Bible-beating gun nuts constitute at least 2/3 of GOP voters. 2/3. The easiest way, and perhaps the best way to gauge the number of Trump Republicans versus the number of anti-Trump Republicans within the GOP is any poll related to the 2020 election denial. Since 2021, those polls have ranged from 61% to 72% of likely GOP voters believing that the 2020 election was stolen, with the earliest and latest polls both favoring an accurate estimate of roughly 2/3 of likely GOP voters being blind faith Trumplicans. If you assume roughly half the country votes Republican and the other half votes Democrat, MAGA is roughly 1/3 of the voting public, since 1/2 of 2/3 is 1/3. Since Trump received 75 million votes in 2020, this arithmetic works out to at least 50 million American voters being MAGA. At the absolute least, 50 million adult Americans can be described as either Confederate flag wavers, Bible beaters, gun nuts, or some combination of those labels. Think about that as you watch the remaining parts of this episode, because if you look at the other subcultures in America, none of them are bigger than the collection of MAGA, Confederate flag-waving, Bible-beating gun nuts. The second most difficult aspect of MAGA to accept is that this sociocultural amalgamation has been an enormous part of American society since the country's founding and will always be an enormous part of American society. If you've ever lived in the Deep South, even in cities as bright and vivacious as Nashville, Nolens, and Charleston, you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the societal flame of white trash ignorance will never be extinguished. Because it cannot be extinguished. It cannot be extinguished because there will always be ignorance, there will always be pride, and there will always be fear. If you've watched the NFL this season, you might have noticed "End racism. It takes all of us" painted in the end line. What a wonderful country America would be if this goal were attainable. The proclamation itself admits that the goal is unattainable because all of us is impossible in a free society of over 330 million people. There will always be a large percentage, a larger percentage than any of us would ever care to admit, of our society that chooses ignorance, pride, and fear over cognizance, humility, and hope. Put more simply, try as you might, lefties, centrists, independents, and anti-Trump Republicans, even if we all work together to do it. Killing racism in America is impossible. Replacing organized religion with evolved spirituality is impossible. Bringing gun nuts back from gun obsession to responsible gun ownership is impossible.